Tonight, Central Weekend takes you further than anywhere before, out into the eternity of space. Is there anyone out there watching us? And if there is, do they know that there's life here on planet Earth? And have they visited us?
Welcome to another series of Central Weekend. It's good to be back after our summer break, and tonight, as you've heard from Andy up there on the roof, we're looking at the mystery of unidentified flying objects. Here in the studio, we'll be talking to people who claim they've seen them. We'll be showing you film of unexplained lights in the sky, and we'll meet the skeptics who say it's all a load of nonsense. UFOs. Is this light skimming across the treetops a visitor from another planet? Could it be a top-secret military aircraft, or is it a hoax? In part 3, we ask the question, are we being visited from outer space?
Central Weekend live from Birmingham, and I wonder if anyone out there is watching us tonight too, because between now and midnight we're looking at the unexplained phenomenon of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. In the studio are people who claim they've seen them, people too who've made it their business to study the whole subject and who've come to the conclusion that it's all a load of nonsense. Well, tonight we give you the evidence to judge for yourselves. Now, you may think that UFOs have been around more or less for a century or so, but people have been seeing strange things in the sky for much, much longer than that. In 98 AD, 2 Roman soldiers sighted one over Rome. At sunset, a burning shield passed over the sky. It sparkled from the west and passed to the east. 1254, a mysterious coloured ship was seen by monks over St Albans in Hertfordshire. 1290, a large silver disc brought activities at Bylands Abbey, Yorkshire, to a standstill as it flew overhead. 1741, over London, Lord Beauchamp saw a small ball of fire drop through the sky, level off half a mile above the ground, and then streak eastwards with a fiery tail. 1820, in Ebrem, France, the townspeople saw a stream of saucer-shaped objects flying over in formation. 1833, Niagara, USA, a large luminous object hovered for an hour over the falls. 1976, the Concorde, travelling at subsonic speed, is buzzed by a small white visitor. The Aetherius Society, describing itself as an international spiritual brotherhood, claims to be in touch with the UFOs. Its leader, His Eminence Sir George King, Order of St. Paul, Doctor of Philosophy, Doctor of Literature, Doctor of Divinity, Metropolitan Archbishop of the Aetherius Churches, says he talks regularly to the Cosmic Masters, and one of his appointed ministers talked to us about the spaceships they drive.
This model has been made to specifications which have been confirmed by our founder president, but of course many people have seen this kind of craft. It measures 35.5 feet in its full form from edge to edge, and it is the type of craft which is most commonly recognized. The other type, of course, is the mothership, which is the long cigar-shaped object, and again these are very commonly seen, including smaller craft like this entering and coming out of those motherships.
Jenny Randalls is a former schoolteacher who now spends her time researching UFO phenomena.
The actual idea that UFOs are spaceships piloted by aliens is terribly attractive to anybody who gets involved in the UFO phenomenon. It's the thing that people out there want to believe. Unfortunately, if you're being objective about this subject, what you have to realize is that the evidence for that is fairly limited. There is not anything like the number of photographs that we should have. Most of the photographs we do have are of vague amorphous blobs of light.
Lord Hill Norton is an admiral of the fleet and was chief of the defence staff between 1971 and 1973, and is not a man given to fanciful notions.
Well, unfortunately, anybody who talks about UFOs is rubbish at once, and I don't doubt that when this interview appears on television screens in many people's homes, they'll think, poor old chap, he's really lost his marbles at last. But it's a shame, because there is something going on. There have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of sightings in countries all over the world in the last few years, and everybody admits that between 5 and 10% of them have never been explained. And if I may add, many of these sightings are by experienced police officers, airline pilots, and sensible people who who don't hallucinate and don't make up silly stories to get themselves on the box.
Talking of the box, it was one of our own film crews which filmed this UFO in Oxfordshire in 1971. So excited were they turned the camera on themselves to record their impressions.
Well, first of all, we saw what appeared to be a very large vapor trail, much thicker than the normal vapor trails. And when this vapor trail finished, it stopped at a straight line, you know, as opposed to fading out. The object, which was obviously circular and an orange-yellow color, seemed to stop very slowly and then very quickly out of frame. And it went so quickly, you just couldn't follow it. It seemed to be an amazing speed, it really was.
We've talked, all of us, the unit, of course, we've talked about it. We all think that what we would like to say really is that we don't know what it was, so we call it a UFO.
The ATV film crew case is typical of many UFO sightings in that there were dozens of witnesses who saw something very clearly in the sky. We were able to track down, interview witnesses, get their angles of view and so on, and therefore use mathematical calculations to work out exactly the speed, the direction, and the location from where the object came from. And this gave us an opportunity to actually figure out what the thing was. And by checking back through all the sources that we tend to use, such as airports and weather centres and so on, we were able to ascertain fairly clearly that in this case, it was actually an aircraft, probably an F-111 from the US Air Force Base at Upper Hayford, which was dumping fuel into the atmosphere to get rid of it for some reason, which is not exactly legal and not exactly illegal, but was something they'd rather not talk about.
Wing Commander Cyril Withers was the principal scientific officer for the Ministry of Defence at RAF Boscombe in Wiltshire when, in 1952, he witnessed something which made an indelible impression upon him. His job involved the secret testing of equipment aboard a Canberra PR-9.
This was a very special flight in that we'd been asked to test a Canberra aircraft at as high an altitude as possible and find out exactly how high the aircraft would go. We managed to get up to 55,000 feet, mainly at that stage to test the radar unit. Just about as we were to call it a day, we suddenly got a signal on the radar. This we discovered was about 8 miles away from us and shining very, very brightly. Now, this could have been entirely sun reflection, or it could have been self-generated brilliance. We still wanted to confirm that it was not any sort of false indication. And we could actually see in the distance something glistening. It was about 30 to 40 feet diameter with a central dome. We were quite determined to report this to the ground station when we got down, in view of the fact that no other aircraft at that time could fly or be flying from any country at that altitude. To say what speed it was going at, I would be very difficult to say, but it certainly be well in excess of 200 knots, well in excess of that. I would think possibly more like 500, because it vanished so quickly. I'm still convinced that this was some reconnaissance object from another planet, and that I wouldn't like to guess. I would think that it was certainly generated by something quite different to anything we know of.
This flying saucer, secretly built and flown by the Americans in 1959, clearly demonstrates that saucer talk is not all hot air. It's called the Avro car and was designed to take off vertically and to cruise at 500 kilometers per hour. It wasn't very good at either, and the project was abandoned. We've come a long way since then, and rumours are abroad of an aeroplane which flies by night and is invisible to radar. Could it be that the military have a real UFO all of their own? Just published is a book about such aircraft. They're called stealth aircraft, and it's written by aviation expert Bill Sweetman.
I think it's possible that some UFO sightings in recent years could have been stealth aircraft. In the last few years, it's been reported that these aircraft have operated out of bases in Europe as well as out of their secret base in Nevada. These aeroplanes are very effectively silenced. It also could involve active camouflage so that it tends to blend in with its background. so that the layman would see a shape flying quite close to him at high speed near the ground, and apparently making no noise.
I can't remember who it was who said that when you've eliminated all the possibilities, you've got to start looking at the impossibilities. I don't believe it's a secret weapon, because I think if it were, I would know about it. And if I did know about it, I wouldn't be allowed to tell you. So I'm bound to feel that there may be a possibility of an extraterrestrial solution to this problem. I simply don't know how it possibly works, but it's the only solution, or theory anyway, that seems to me to fit the facts.
In 1973, this film of a ball of coloured light, somewhat pale through copying, was chased by Peter Day and his 8mm camera.
I saw what looked like an orange ball going across the treetops as I was travelling along to a job. I turned off the main road, got out the camera and started filming this thing, which was flying, I suppose, about 250, 300 miles an hour, just above the treetops. Size of it, well, now, what can I say? About 30 feet, if it was 30 feet away from somebody holding an orange, that would be about the size it looked. When I finally got home, I rang up Upper Hayford because my wife had said there was something on the news about that morning about an F-111 having crashed. Got hold of a major, he was the CO there. He said, yes, we did lose an F-111. The aircraft went out of control and later crashed over at Newport Pagnell and burst into flames. So what it was, nobody knows. It is possible, of course, that if it was a genuine UFO, if there's such a thing as a genuine UFO, that it did cause the F-111 to crash, because to my knowledge, they don't know why that thing crashed to this day.
The Peter Day film is a very good example of a genuine UFO in the true sense of the word. That is, it's a typical sort of funny blob of orange light. It's not a giant alien spaceship. And it's exactly what we have. The good cases always reflect that kind of thing. They are not metallic spaceships. They are puzzling things in the atmosphere.
It's an interesting orange blob on a piece of film. I would say it's a legitimate unidentified flying object. There are no conventional explanations that come to mind after you run it several times. It certainly isn't ball lightning or a balloon or any of those things. I certainly cannot say that it establishes that we're dealing with extraterrestrial spacecraft. It's an unknown, but I won't take that next step.
Stanton Friedman is a research scientist who's become fascinated by the UFO question. His qualifications are impressive, and if anyone should know what constitutes evidence of a UFO and what UFOs might be, it's Stanton T. Friedman.
The evidence we have is in many different forms. We have landing trace cases from 65 countries, more than 2,400 such cases where physical changes are produced. The evidence is indeed overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. We have radar visual sightings from all over the world, combined multiple witness radar visual sightings. We have the observations from people whose testimony we would accept on anything else. And we have a half a dozen large-scale scientific studies that most of the people that I've talked to are totally unaware of. Large-scale efforts frequently done for governments in which they explain most sightings and are left with a residue, 10 to 20%, which not only can't be explained, that wouldn't be enough, but which when you examine the physically observable characteristics, size, shape, surface texture, and the behavior, the ability to fly up and down, back and forth, make right-angled turns at 2,000 miles an hour, fly horizontally at, say, 10,000 miles an hour. When you put that together, what's left is manufactured objects whose behavior we cannot yet duplicate. This is going back over the last 30-some years, with things we can manufacture. If they weren't built here, they were built someplace else. There's a particular case which gives us a clue that they apparently come from a planet around either Zeta 1 or Zeta 2 reticuli, two stars you can't see from here. You got to go down near the equator. They're only 37 light years away, which is just down the street on a cosmic scale.
This UFO, flying over the Pacific island called Santa Catalina, a millionaire's playground 20 miles out of Los Angeles, was filmed by the United States Navy. In this case, the Freedom of Information Act was responsible for opening the files to release it. And because the source is unimpeachable, it's somehow more convincing. But to those of us who have no specialist knowledge of things that fly, what we're seeing now might easily convince us we'd spotted something extraordinary, even if we didn't shout UFO. It's called the Sprite RPV, a remote pilotless vehicle which flies almost silently and can be radio controlled from as far away as 25 miles. Its job is to spy with a television camera, and it's been responsible for quite a number of alleged UFO sightings. Weather balloons are also very deceiving, especially when the sun's reflecting off their skins, which can be 200 feet in diameter and 20 miles up in the sky. This one has a massive payload and will be blown around and around the world, sending down weather information. It will maintain its correct altitude automatically. But when the objects can't be identified, it's a serious business. It happened again in May this year when the Brazilian Air Force took off to investigate 13 radar contacts flying in formation over Sao Paulo. The national newspaper O Globo reported,
"The behavior of the lights and radar contacts do not correspond to any standard known in civil aviation." This sentence was repeated by the 7 pilots and the 3 ground controllers who endeavored to follow the UFOs. It happened on a clear night, ideal for seeing things at a distance, and without heavy cloud which could cause faults on the radar.
According to Lieutenant Kleber, who chased one of the UFOs,
"I tried to get closer, but it was as if one was trying to arrive at a point of the infinite. The object had a very intense red light, which changed to white, then to green, even to turn back to red.
Captain De Freitas chased another.
It made zigzags at angles equal to 80 degrees. I do not know any apparatus capable of making turns in that way at 1,000 kilometers per hour.
The objects left Brazilian airspace, easily avoiding interception. The chase was abandoned. By now, do you have a sneaking suspicion that something might just be going on? What's needed is some proof, some detailed photography, unlike these vague shapes and fuzzy outlines. Timothy Good has spent the last 30 years researching and writing about UFOs.
Absurd though this business sounds, in July 1947, an unidentified object, and it was clearly that, came down near Roswell, New Mexico. Now, there have been many independent witnesses who saw the wreckage, people who actually handled the wreckage and have testified that it was like nothing on Earth.
Major Jesse Marcel was the intelligence officer based at Roswell when a farmer reported he'd found the remains of a crashed spaceship.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was. There were just fragments strewn all over the area, an area about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide.
Major Marcel described some of the wreckage as having strange numerical writing on it, a type of hieroglyphics. Other parts were as thin as silver foil, yet could not be torn, burnt, or even bent when hammered. The wreckage was loaded aboard a B-29 aircraft and flown to another airbase called Carswell in Texas, where, under armed guard, it was transferred to another aircraft and taken to an unknown destination.
The newsmen saw very little of that material, a very small portion of it. And none of the important things, like these members that had these hieroglyphics or markings on it. They wanted me to tell them about it, and I couldn't say anything. And when the general came in, he told me not to say anything, that he would handle it.
General Ramey released a story that a weather balloon had crashed.
I have talked to 91 people in conjunction with this one event. That includes Air Force generals, FBI agents, counterintelligence corps agents, the rancher who picked up the pieces, his children who handled the pieces, the local news media guys who were told one story and then a second one after the military got to the rancher. But we have an enormous amount of information, culled at great cost and time and expense, and finding people, because many of these were military people and they spread to the winds. But that event in July 1947 was the crucial event at setting up the secret project that apparently has been directing things. Once you've got pieces, then you want to figure out how they work, obviously. And if they're alien spacecraft, it's going to take you a long time, but you may very well learn all kinds of technological advantages.
The New Mexico incident has all the ingredients of the epic legend. Roswell was the base from where the first atom bombs were flown. It's not far from Los Alamos, where the atom bomb was developed. It's in the same desert where the atom bomb was tested. Any alien intelligence keeping an eye on Earth would certainly want to drop in here. But for all the evidence, there's a mountain of denial, and one is left with the official explanation of a balloon. They were dropping all over the west coast of America just 2 years before, when the Japanese sent incendiary bombs hanging from large paper balloons. Some of them crashed in New Mexico. Crashed flying saucer stories are not confined to America. We have one of our own. It took place just outside the United States Air Force Base at Woodbridge in Suffolk. This is Colonel Charles Holt, the commanding officer's official report.
Early in the morning of 27th December 1980, two USAF security police patrolmen saw unusual lights outside the back gates at RAF Woodbridge. The individuals reported seeing a strange glowing object in the forest. The object was described as being metallic in appearance and triangular in shape.
Well, I've taken a good deal of interest in the Bentwaters incident because it was so widely publicized. Books have been written about it. I've listened to tapes made by cable news and people like that. And I've had a certain amount of dealings with ministers over this particular incident, the only one I have. And I think, in a nutshell, one of two things happened. Either something entered our airspace, landed at Bentwaters, or United States Air Force officers and senior non-commissioned officers were hallucinating. And in either explanation, there must be a defense interest in it, contrary to what the government has repeatedly said.
Which of those two alternatives do you prefer?
I myself think it's very difficult indeed to discount the almost certainty that something landed there.
Something from where?
I've no idea. I wish I had.
At the Ministry of Defense, I spoke to Roger Freeman, Minister for the Armed Forces.
Well, clearly there was no threat to the American unit based at RAF Woodbridge, or indeed RAF Bentwaters. If there had been, then both ourselves and the American Air Force, American forces, would have responded instantly. But there was no threat. There is perhaps doubt in the mind, certainly of the officer who reported the incident, what the nature of the occurrence was. But there are things that happen in our lives every day where you can't necessarily explain what has happened or why it's happened.
Later in the night, a red, sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved and pulsed. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles and then broke into 5 separate white objects.
The report is, in fact, very detailed and without any trace of doubt in the description of that object. That same night, there were hundreds of reports from Cornwall to Yorkshire of an extremely bright light in the sky, which was followed by about 20 smaller lights.
I don't doubt at all that governments all over the world, with the possible exception of the French, have kept information available to them about these matters secret, because much of it is now flowing out in the United States under their Freedom of Information Act, which wouldn't have been released otherwise.
Our job at the Ministry of Defense is in a rational and, I hope, painstaking and calm way to investigate all UFO sightings and reports. We are responsive, we are reactive. We investigate them thoroughly and satisfy ourselves that there was no threat to national security. If there had been, at the time of the sighting, then our response would have been immediate, and those of our allies would have been immediate.
If there were to be an announcement tomorrow by two highly trusted individuals around the world, the Queen and the Pope, for example, saying indeed some flying saucers are extraterrestrial spacecraft and they're neutral, you can imagine what would happen. The stock market would go down, mental hospital admissions and church attendance would go up, and there'd be an immediate push on the part of the younger generation, never alive when there wasn't a space program, for a whole new view of ourselves, instead of as Americans, Chinese, Canadians, Israelis, as Earthlings. There isn't any government on this planet that wants its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet instead of that individual government. Nationalism's the only game in town, really.
What an interesting thought. Well, Heather Cooper, you're president of the British Astronomical Association. Now, your association, more than anyone, spends an awful lot of its time looking skywards. What do you make of UFOs?
I make the fact that they're entirely natural phenomena. I mean, as you say, my association out of all is the one that looks. I have amateur astronomers who are out in their back gardens every night. We have photographic patrols which have all-sky cameras which look at everything that goes up in the sky. Most of those things are clouds, of course, from this country, but when it is clear, we see all kinds of strange things flashing across the sky. And when you examine them, what they turn out to be? ordinary meteors, which are small particles coming into the Earth's atmosphere, odd things like bats and, dare I say it, owls who are illuminated by streetlights. I'm quite convinced to myself that 100% of unidentified flying objects, 100% of unidentified flying objects eventually will be identified flying objects.
Have any of your astronomers come across anything that they can't explain that they could perhaps put down to?
And don't you think that's very suggestive that astronomers who are out there every night looking at the sky haven't actually come up with something that stumped them?
Are they actually looking for life from other planets?
Yes, astronomers all around the world, both amateurs and professional, are very much looking for life. Now, of course, the problem at the moment, in terms of professional funding, is that there isn't the money which can actually allow you to indulge a fetish for looking for extraterrestrial life, much as astronomers would love to. And believe me, Andy, it's the astronomers who would love to have confirmation of their beliefs that there is life on other worlds.
Have you yourself got an open mind?
I believe implicitly, I have faith that there's life in other worlds. But on the other hand, I'm a scientist, and the evidence at the moment is weighed, I'd say, fairly heavily against it. But I would love to believe. I can't believe that you and me and central television is all there is to the universe.
Well, it rather actually shoots Timothy Good's notion down in flames. He spent 30 years, cosmic flames if not, he spent 30 years studying, lecturing about UFOs. One of the points raised in the film was that we always seem to get a fuzzy outline, nothing that is definitely identifiable. Why do you think that is?
In the case of photographs, this is absolutely rubbish, because there have been dozens of photographs showing very clearly delineated objects. I've got lots of them. They are available to the public for study. The trouble is that the clearer photographs are, the more likely they are to be pronounced a hoax.
Does the Aetherius Society, again, which was mentioned in the film, does that actually help your cause, that group, or does it?
Not in the slightest. People are entitled to their religious beliefs, but I wish they'd leave them out of UFOs. And although I do accept there obviously are connotations of a religious nature attached to UFOs, that's obvious, I think, to all of us here.
Now, you spent 30 years, as I said, studying the subject. Yeah. If you wanted to convince all of us here tonight in the studio and people watching at home, what is the sort of overriding thought that you've come out with, having studied the subject for 30 years, that might convince us tonight that there is something out there?
Other than bringing one here in the studio, you mean?
Yes, quite.
Well, I'd like to take Heather up, actually. She said astronomers don't see these things. That's absolute nonsense. Astronomers have been reporting them for several hundred years. Some of the best astronomers, professional astronomers in the world.
Name an astronomer.
Professor Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered the planet Pluto in 1930.
But I was talking to him last year, and he said it's a load of old codswallop.
Well, he's given highly detailed reports. He certainly didn't say that when he reported the studies.
Oh, dear. Anyway.
Also, a number of others, like Frank Halstead. What convinces me, and has convinced me since 1955, is the fact that these things have been observed by highly qualified observers. Not just hundreds, but thousands of reports by military pilots, civilian pilots, air traffic controllers, radar operators. There have been dozens of reports where UFOs have approached aircraft, military aircraft, and civilian aircraft at very close level, causing interference not only with communication systems so that the pilots cannot communicate with base, interference with control systems, and interference with weapon systems, and these are documented officially in government records.
Melvin Harris, let me just bring in Melvin Harris here. Melvin, how would you explain those tens of thousands of sightings? Now, you've just come out with a new book called You've Been Duped, which essentially is the truth behind classic mysteries. This is indeed a classic mystery. How would you explain those tens of thousands of sightings?
Well, first of all, the mysteries I investigate are those of the paranormal as such, and my interest in UFOs as such is marginal, for the simple reason that years ago I took almost everything that was published on UFOs. I read them diligently, and in the end I just gave up, because to my mind there was an element there which I'd like to touch on in a moment, because I don't intend to be sidetracked by discussing what this pilot or that pilot says, because I'm more concerned with the mass following that the UFOs have. And that mass following is not that of trained observers or pilots, but it's great masses of people who implicitly believe that, in fact, extraterrestrials are visiting us. For them, there are no UFOs, there are spaceships. And that's what the whole thing is about. And to me, there's a parallel between that form of belief and some of the beliefs in things like poltergeists and PK and ghosts, etc. First of all, you've got three factors. You've got a cultural conditioning. By that I mean that that once you get an idea that's born and is propagated by unscrupulous writers, and there's a whole host of them, and I'm sure Timothy will agree with me there, people like Brad Steiger and Frank Edwards and Vaughan Wilkins and others like that, people who would take any story which was sensational, would not research it, but would regurgitate it in their books. Once you get these mass outpouring...
You're saying people are taken in?
No, what I'm saying is this. First of all, there is the exposure to the whole idea of the spaceship and the inhabitant, the extraterrestrial. Once that becomes common, once you see these things in your news agents, once you see them transported in the form of television programs, in the form of fictional films, etc., it becomes something which is acceptable in the back of a lot of people's minds. It almost becomes part of their culture. And then you get another factor, and that's known as the expectancy set. When you expect to see things, or are looking for things, or think that such a thing is possible, you will actually end up by seeing them. And there's a third factor, which is the cryptomnesic factor, and that is something which plays a part in things like hypnotic regressions to past lives. And there you find that people, cryptomnesia is like this. Imagine that your mind is a big storehouse, and it's got all sorts of jumbled up things in it. Bits and pieces you've heard at lectures, seen on television, films,
people are picking
glimpses
things
of
up
magazines. They're picking things up all the time. You go into a bookshop, you maybe get buying Fur and Feather or the Racing Gazette, but on your way in you see a number of UFO magazines. Immediately you're seeing these, but not consciously registering them, but they're being registered somewhere. Think of it as a subconscious memory bank. That means that you've got something there working in your mind which at times can give you the feeling that you know more about a subject than you really read. And of course that's true, you do know.
Let's now bring in some of the members of the audience, because the reason that many of them are here is because they've experienced something which is rather out of the ordinary. Let me come to Valerie Walters and Rosemary Hawkins. Now, Rosemary, did you yourself, when you had your experience, feel that it was something that was being regurgitated from the depths of your mind?
Definitely not.
Tell us exactly what happened.
We were returning home after a night out, the early hours of the morning, and we saw some very bright lights in the sky. They became very bright, and they came closer, and as we followed them down the road, we could see that the object was round, and there was no doubt about that. It was very solid. It was not a balloon or anything like that. And we followed it down the road until it disappeared. And it was at a later date when we were interviewed that we found out we'd lost half an hour in time.
How typical, Timothy, is that, do you think, of the kind of sightings that you come across?
Very typical.
What do you think could have happened in that half-hour period?
She saw an unidentified flying object.
But there's a half-hour
time? I have no idea.
There is a half-hour loss there. What explanation did you actually get yourselves about that loss of half an hour?
Well, we were hypnotized, but as yet we've never come to a complete story. We don't know the ending. We only got halfway through the hypnosis sessions.
One of the interesting points about all of the cases, which is often said, is it not, Timothy, is that sightings are often observed by people out in the field, like farmers, etc. But there are also sightings from people like airline pilots, as you mentioned, and indeed policemen. Now, we have with us Alan Godfrey, who in fact was a former policeman.
That's true, yeah.
And you had a very unusual sighting, which has actually changed your life.
That's quite true, yeah. That's about 5 years ago now. I was driving the police car at the time, early hours of the morning, and I came across where I thought at that time was a bus that had slid across the road sideways. When I approached the object, I got within about 20 yards of it, and immediately I came across what I now would describe as a UFO. It was about 20 feet wide, 14 feet high. It was diamond-shaped. It had a bank of windows in, and the bottom half of it was rotating. The police blue beacon was bouncing back off it, as were my headlights. It was hovering off the ground about 5 feet, and it was very, very frightening. Very frightening.
And what happened as a result of that sighting?
Well, immediately. Nothing happened at all for about 12 months within the force. And then due to publicity at that time being aroused around the case, a lot of pressure was put on me to not say anything. I was made to sign documents. I had to visit certain places. I had to go under any hypnotic regressions. I had to dissociate myself with any person that was interested in UFOs.
Did you feel that you may be victim of some kind of a cover-up?
Well, that's catch-22.
Well, yes or no?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
That was a point, Timothy, was it not, that was brought out during the conversation with Lord Hill Norton. He actually said that he felt, as an Admiral of the Fleet, that there could have been a cover-up.
Yes, more important, as a chief of defence staff as well, he ought to know if there's been a cover-up about UFOs, and he's convinced there is.
What makes you convinced that there has been?
Well, evidence that has now been released under the Freedom of Information Act in the States, which has long been denied, is gradually coming out. Thousands and thousands of pages from the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, US Air Force Intelligence, US Army Intelligence, Naval Intelligence, State Department, and so forth. Stories which have long been denied, and now we are slowly but surely
One of the
getting
stories that Lord Hill Norton was referring to was the RAF Woodbridge incident.
Yes.
Let me bring in Heather there. What would you interpret, as we mentioned in the film, the incident on that particular evening that was outlined by Colonel Charles Holt?
I think the whole point about UFO stories is that the whole story appears on the front of it to hang together very, very well. But when you actually look into the bits of the story, they don't hang together quite as well. Now, the Woodbridge story was investigated by two of my colleagues, as it turned out, independently.
It was also, though, outlined by senior US Air Force officers.
And they got it wrong. They actually went and garbled their memo. The Colonel-in-Chief actually got two things confused. He got his dates wrong. The previous night to the first sighting of something coming into the forest behind Woodbridge, there was a Cosmos rocket, a Russian rocket, which re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, and as it did so, it burnt up. The next night, a meteor, a standard bit of debris coming in from space, also came in and burnt up, and that was seen over most of England. When people went to investigate what was going on in the forest, they saw a flashing light. "Why," said the forest keeper, "yeah, I know what that is. It's a lighthouse beam." And there was a lighthouse beam which you could just see through the trees, which appeared to give out sort of beams of radiation every so often. Then people said they'd seen landing marks. Well, when these landing marks were investigated, they turned out to be rabbit tracks which had been covered up with pine needles. Well, said some of the investigators, the trees had been damaged. There were holes on the trees which had obviously been caused by the landing craft coming down. Well, not according to the Forestry Commission, who simply said that those were marks made on the trees to give them a sign that the foresters should fell them. But the point I'm making, actually, is that many of these stories don't stand up under examination. They're a stream of coincidences.
Have you interviewed any of the witnesses, the first-hand witnesses?
I've actually interviewed the people who went and followed up afterwards.
No, I want to know, have you investigated?
No, I haven't, in that case.
Have you?
I haven't either myself, but I have listened to tape-recorded interviews with some of the first-hand witnesses, and I'm convinced that something landed there.
Now, Heather there seemed to give a relatively reasonable explanation to something that couldn't be explained. Would any of you accept that kind of explanation for what maybe you saw?
No. I have met Colonel Holt. My colleague and myself, Mike Sachs, we have been invited to the base. We have met Colonel Holt.
You are Harry Harris?
I'm Harry Harris.
Yes.
I have cultivated some sort of friendship with Colonel Holt over the last 4 years. In broad terms, what Colonel Holt said to me was that they were confronted by a mechanical device of unknown origin, which they surrounded, tried to get into and onto, and which avoided them. At the present point in time, and I've spoken 3 times in the last fortnight to Colonel Holt in the States, to which my telephone bill will bear witness.
Witness as well.
Yes, he is considering, and I've put this to him, and I've sent him something to sign. He is considering signing a letter calling upon President Reagan to hold a public inquiry into the events at Rendlesham, whereby each and every Air Force officer and Air Force man who was present can come forward before a panel of scientists and explain exactly what they experienced. This may not necessarily identify what was seen, but at least it will help to put on the public record for history, whether or not, and I don't know because I wasn't there, but whether or not...
Do you really believe that that will be the case, that they will come forward for a public inquiry?
Well, I think the answer lies with Colonel Holt. If he's prepared to stand up and be counted, I suspect we might get it. It's up to Holt. He was, I think, the senior officer present. But when the lady over there talks about the lighthouse, I put this to Holt many times, he assures me that no way was this the lighthouse.
Well, that's one particular incident which we can talk about for a long period of time as being exceptionally well documented. Let me bring in Kevin Pratt, because your family had an experience, not just one family, two families had an experience, and you again say it's actually changed your whole outlook on life.
Well, it definitely has. I've never forgot it. It's clear in my mind. It was 3 objects that were stationary. Now, okay, so if the weather balloons, you can accept that, but not something that speeds off after being stationary, speeds off faster than any jet I've ever seen. And that's back in the 1960s, so jets are a lot faster now, and I don't think I've seen anything that flies faster than that now.
What explanation were you given at the time?
No explanation. It was the negative and the camera was sent to various places around the world, not just in this country. And there was no explanation to it, but there were offers from one source, I can't remember, but my brother knows the source, offers of payment for the negative. And it was just a cheap, simple camera that was used. And it's, you know, it's just unexplainable.
Melvin, unexplainable maybe, but would you have an explanation for that?
No, because as an investigator, I don't come up, like many of the people who advocate the idea of extraterrestrials, and make a bold statement about something I've never investigated. I don't know. I don't know the case, I've never seen the photographs, I don't know the people involved. What I do know is this, that there are many, many reports of things which perhaps the origin of them is concealed for military purposes. That can happen very often. I mean, I know a few little military secrets myself, only tiny ones, but I know that at times even branches of say, the Air Force may not know what X is doing. X and Y may not know what each one is doing. That's true. But there's another factor, and you have to consider this thing that I mentioned earlier, it's cultural conditioning. I don't know whether you listen to Irish radio at all, but recently in Ireland, there's been a spate of moving statues. In one place, one church, someone said, we saw the statue of the Virgin Mary move, and immediately people started flocking to the church. And then, throughout the whole of the Republic, you had statues of the Virgin Mary moving, and people flocking to them, and all swearing it was happening.
Swearing it was happening. You were raising your hand before. Does that kind of explanation have any relevance to what you actually experienced?
Basically, what I want to say, you've all been talking about in the sky, which you've seen, but I'm talking about a visual sight, a matter of 15, 18 feet away from myself. I've got a slight bit of proof, not a lot in a short time like this. Coins which was in my pocket on the night of the encounter. Various photos of the landing sites, probably can't see them on the camera. Yes, no?
Well,
I'd love to talk to you later on, all of you, and...
you saw something that was 18 inches away from you?
18 feet. 18 feet.
18 feet away from you?
Yes. There are the coins. The water, all the coins is bent, the water out of the car.
Heather,
I can go on forever.
That's as close as you could probably get to the sort of, you know, the little green man being 18 feet away from you.
Well, have you had those coins subjected to any analysis?
Oh, yes.
What did they come up with?
Nothing. They can tell, I can't tell you now, they can tell you what strain has caused it, but no way could it be done without making marks on them.
That's not true. But anyway, the point is, I mean, can I say that scientists would love to have evidence for extraterrestrial life? But the point that I would like to make most strongly is that we look up into the atmosphere, we see things that people call UFOs. Why should they come from outside the Earth? Because 99% of the things we see up there are within the Earth's atmosphere.
Well, maybe they're listening or watching us tonight. Timothy, we're running out of time. The final word, more or less, from yourself.
I'd like to say that the fact of extraterrestrial life was actually established in 1947, partly due to that crashed UFO. This has been confirmed by Dr. Robert Sarbacher, who is presently the head of the Washington Institute of Technology, and a number of other very important scientists who formed an investigation group afterwards, headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. George Marshall, General George Marshall, who was United States Chief of Staff in the United States Army in the last war, and subsequently Secretary of State, has confirmed that the United States authorities actually have crashed UFOs and that their source is
Well,
extraterrestrial.
one day, hopefully, we're going to see them. We're going to crash out of this now, actually, if you don't mind, and hand back over to Sue, who's somewhere in the universe.
Well, thank you, Andy. The mysteries of space may be infinite, but obviously time on Central Weekend is not. We've run out. Thank you for being with us, and good night, wherever you are.